They said the boy had not spoken a single word in 312 days, but no one ever asked whether silence was the only language he had left. Every morning before sunrise, Amara Johnson stepped through the towering iron gates of the DeLuca estate carrying nothing more than a worn canvas tote, a thermos of black coffee, and the quiet determination that had carried her through every difficult season of her life. The mansion stood on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic like a fortress carved from old money and impossible expectations, its limestone walls glowing pale beneath the first hints of dawn. Inside, polished marble reflected crystal chandeliers that never seemed to dim, priceless paintings watched every hallway, and staff members moved with practiced precision, speaking in hushed voices as though the house itself demanded silence. On her first week, the head housekeeper had explained the rules without ever raising her voice. Never interrupt Mr. Lorenzo DeLuca. Never ask questions about the security team. Never enter the East Wing unless instructed. And above all, never approach his son. The last rule lingered in the air long after the others had faded. People exchanged uneasy glances whenever the boy was mentioned, then quickly returned to their work as if pretending he did not exist somehow protected them from a sadness too heavy to carry. Amara accepted every instruction with a polite nod because she needed this job more than she needed answers. Bills did not care about curiosity, and neither did rent. Still, over the next several days, something tugged quietly at her attention. It was not a cry or a tantrum. It was the absence of ordinary childhood sounds. No laughter echoed through the enormous halls. No footsteps raced across the hardwood floors. No cartoons played behind closed doors. It was as though the mansion had forgotten what a child was supposed to sound like. On the fourth afternoon, while dusting an upstairs gallery lined with family portraits, Amara noticed a small paper airplane resting beneath a console table. It was folded with surprising care, one wing slightly bent, as though someone had launched it only to watch it fall. Without chasing after it, she picked it up gently, smoothing the crease with her fingertips before placing it on the table. As she turned to leave, she caught the faintest movement at the end of the hallway. A young boy, no older than 9, stood barefoot beside a sunlit window, his blue sweater hanging loosely from narrow shoulders. His hazel eyes rested on the paper airplane, then shifted to Amara for only a heartbeat before drifting away again. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply watched the floating dust caught in the afternoon light as though it were telling him a story no one else could hear. Before Amara could offer even the smallest greeting, another employee hurried toward her, his expression suddenly tense. "Don't," he whispered, almost pleading. "Please, just leave him alone." Amara looked back once more, but the boy had already disappeared into the quiet, leaving only the paper airplane behind and a feeling she could not explain, as if the deepest silence in that magnificent house had just looked directly into her eyes. The image of the paper airplane lingered in Amara Johnson's thoughts long after her shift ended. She had cleaned luxury homes before, but there was something different about the DeLuca estate. It was not the polished marble floors or the grand staircase wrapped in handcrafted iron railings. It was the feeling that every beautiful room was holding its breath. The following morning, she arrived just before 6 o'clock as the sky turned soft shades of blue above the Atlantic Ocean. The kitchen staff prepared breakfast with quiet efficiency while security personnel rotated shifts at the front entrance. Every routine unfolded with perfect precision except one. A small breakfast tray was always prepared with fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and a glass of orange juice, yet every morning the tray returned almost untouched. No one complained. No one asked why. They simply threw the food away and prepared another tray the next day. On her 7th morning, Amara noticed one detail no one else seemed to acknowledge. Beside the discarded plate rested a tiny sketchbook covered in blue cloth. Curiosity tempted her, but respect stopped her hand before it reached for it. Instead, she quietly picked up the untouched apple from the tray and placed it beside a small ceramic bowl filled with colorful marbles sitting near the hallway window. It felt like a kinder place for it than the trash can. She thought nothing more of the gesture until later that afternoon when she returned to dust the same hallway. The apple was gone. In its place sat a carefully folded paper crane. No note. No explanation. Just the delicate bird standing where the fruit had been. Amora smiled without realizing it. She gently lifted the crane, studying the careful folds before placing it back exactly where she had found it. The next day, she left a sharpened pencil beside the bowl before beginning her work. When she returned an hour later, the pencil had disappeared, replaced by a small drawing of the ocean. The waves were simple but graceful, sketched with remarkable patience. A tiny sailboat floated near the horizon beneath a bright sun drawn with uneven lines. There was no signature, yet she already knew who had made it. Day after day, an unspoken conversation began to grow without either of them saying a single word. She left a smooth seashell collected during her morning walk. The shell became a drawing of a lighthouse. She placed a single white flower from the garden beside the bowl. The next afternoon she found a picture of the same flower resting inside the sketchbook, every petal shaded with surprising care. The other employees never noticed these quiet exchanges because they happened in the forgotten corners of the mansion where few people lingered. But someone else had begun noticing. From the second-floor balcony, Lorenzo De Luca paused more than once on his way to his study. He never interrupted. He simply watched from a distance as the new housemaid continued cleaning without expecting anything in return. She never approached his son. She never demanded eye contact or conversation. She only answered silence with gentle patience. Lorenzo found himself unable to explain why his son had started leaving his room more often, lingering near the hallway windows where sunlight poured across the floor each afternoon. The doctors had called it progress without understanding the reason. Lorenzo was not so certain. For the first time in nearly a year, the enormous mansion no longer felt completely empty, and although no words had yet been spoken, something fragile had quietly begun to awaken inside walls that had forgotten what hope sounded like. The quiet rhythm continued for another week until one warm Thursday afternoon when the estate seemed unusually still. Sunlight spilled across the garden paths, casting long shadows from ancient oak trees that had stood on the property for generations. Amora had been assigned to polish the windows overlooking the back terrace, and as she worked, she noticed a familiar figure standing alone near the edge of the flower garden. The little boy held his sketchbook against his chest while staring at a stone fountain where water drifted gently into a shallow pool. He did not appear frightened. He simply looked as though he was waiting for something he could not describe. Amora hesitated, remembering every warning she had been given. She could have walked away without anyone questioning her. Instead, she quietly picked up a small piece of sidewalk chalk that one of the gardeners had left near the storage bench. Without stepping closer, she knelt several feet away on the stone path and drew a simple sun with smiling eyes. She stood, returned the chalk exactly where she had found it, and resumed cleaning the nearby windows as though nothing unusual had happened. Several minutes passed before she glanced back. The drawing had gained a small cloud beside it. The cloud was neatly outlined in blue chalk. Amora smiled to herself and, the next time she passed the path, added 3 tiny birds flying above the cloud. Again she walked away without waiting for a response. When she looked back through the glass, the boy had crouched beside the drawing. Slowly and carefully, he added an entire ocean beneath the birds, complete with gentle waves and a lighthouse standing proudly along the shore. It became their quiet game, one picture growing from another without either of them asking permission or expecting praise. Neither noticed the tall figure watching from the library balcony above. Lorenzo De Luca had returned early from an important meeting and stopped the moment he saw his son outside. For nearly a year Ethan had refused every invitation to walk through the gardens. Specialists had designed expensive therapy sessions around those very paths, but nothing had persuaded him to stay longer than a minute. Now he remained outside willingly, completely absorbed in a conversation that required no words. Lorenzo descended the staircase with calm but determined steps. By the time he reached the terrace, Ethan had quietly slipped behind a hedge, leaving only the colorful drawings across the stone walkway. Amora immediately lowered her eyes. "I am sorry, sir," she said softly. "I should have cleaned the chalk away." Lorenzo studied the drawings instead of answering. There were suns, boats, birds, flowers, and waves stretching across the path like pages from a child's imagination. None of it should have been there. House rules demanded order, spotless perfection, and polished stone free from childish markings. Yet for reasons he could not explain, the bright colors made the estate feel warmer than it had in years. He finally turned toward Amora, his expression composed but unreadable. "Did you ask my son to come outside?" he asked. "No, sir," she answered honestly. "I only gave him something that did not require an answer." Lorenzo remained silent for several long seconds. He looked toward the garden where Ethan now stood partially hidden behind a flowering tree, holding the blue chalk tightly in one hand. For the briefest moment, father and son looked at each other across the lawn. Ethan did not run away. He simply stayed where he was, watching quietly. It was a small change, almost invisible to anyone else, but Lorenzo felt it with unmistakable clarity. Something inside the walls he had built around both his home and his heart had begun to shift, and for the first time he wondered whether healing sometimes arrived not through grand solutions, but through ordinary kindness offered without expecting anything in return. By the beginning of the second week, the colorful chalk drawings had disappeared. With the evening rain, yet something far more important remained. Ethan no longer stayed hidden behind closed doors from sunrise until bedtime. He wandered quietly through the sunlit corridors, sometimes carrying his blue sketchbook, sometimes stopping beside the tall windows overlooking the ocean for several peaceful minutes before returning to his room. None of the household employees mentioned the change aloud, but they noticed it all the same. The gardeners began leaving fresh flowers where he liked to stand. The kitchen staff quietly prepared blueberry pancakes after discovering he had eaten an entire serving without encouragement. Even the security team, trained to remain expressionless, exchanged brief smiles whenever they saw the young boy outside. Amora accepted these changes with quiet gratitude but never assumed they belonged to her. She continued her work exactly as before, polishing silver, folding freshly pressed linens, dusting bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, and greeting everyone with the same gentle respect. Whenever Ethan happened to appear nearby, she simply acknowledged him with a warm smile before returning to her task. She never invited him closer. She never asked questions. She understood that trust grew best when it was given room to breathe. One cloudy afternoon she entered the family library carrying a basket of freshly folded blankets. The room smelled of cedarwood and old leather, with shelves lined by hundreds of books collected over decades. She noticed a picture book lying open on a low table beside the fireplace. Without thinking, she carefully placed the blanket over the reading chair and began quietly reading the first page aloud while organizing the room. Her voice remained soft and unhurried, never performing, never expecting an audience. The story spoke of a lonely lighthouse keeper who believed every ship had its own journey and every storm eventually found calm water. After finishing 2 pages, she closed the book and continued dusting the shelves. She never looked toward the doorway. A few moments later she heard the faint sound of pages turning. Ethan had stepped inside. He sat cross-legged on the rug, picked up the same book, and slowly turned to the page where she had stopped reading. He did not ask her to continue. He simply followed the story with careful eyes, tracing each illustration with one finger. Amora smiled to herself and resumed polishing the nearby mantel without disturbing him. Several minutes passed in complete silence until another presence filled the room. Lorenzo stood quietly at the entrance, having arrived unnoticed. He expected Ethan to retreat the instant another adult entered, just as he had done for months. Instead, the boy remained seated on the rug with the open book resting across his knees. Lorenzo felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Every expert he had hired had encouraged structured exercises, scheduled conversations, and carefully measured progress. Yet this housemaid had done none of those things. She had offered patience instead of pressure and ordinary moments instead of carefully designed lessons. As Lorenzo watched his son gently turn another page, he realized the silence surrounding Ethan no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. He looked toward Amora, who continued folding blankets as though nothing remarkable had happened. For the first time since she began working at the estate, he saw not simply an employee completing her duties, but someone whose quiet presence had begun restoring a sense of home that money, influence, and endless professional advice had never been able to create. The following Monday arrived wrapped in cool ocean fog, leaving the cliffs beyond the mansion hidden beneath a blanket of silver mist. Inside the estate, the morning unfolded with its familiar rhythm until the head housekeeper hurried into the dining room with quiet urgency. A group of distinguished guests would be arriving that afternoon for a private charity planning meeting hosted by Lorenzo De Luca. Every room had to be flawless, every detail perfectly arranged. Amara spent the morning preparing the grand sitting room, polishing antique tables, arranging fresh white lilies, and carefully placing family photographs back onto the mantel after dusting them. One picture always caught her attention. It showed Lorenzo standing beside a smiling woman with Ethan between them, years younger, holding both of their hands beneath a bright summer sky. The happiness captured in that single photograph felt almost impossible compared to the silence that now filled the house. Amara gently returned the frame to its place and continued working without lingering on questions that were not hers to ask. Shortly after lunch, while carrying clean linens toward the east hallway, she noticed Ethan standing alone beside the enormous bay window overlooking the gardens. Rain had begun to fall lightly, leaving tiny droplets racing down the glass. Without speaking, he rested one hand against the window and watched the birds searching for shelter beneath the trees. Amara quietly unfolded one of the soft blankets she carried and placed it across the nearby reading chair before continuing down the hallway. She did not offer it directly. She simply made it available. When she returned several minutes later, Ethan was sitting beneath the blanket, holding his sketchbook while looking out at the rain. Beside him lay a new drawing. It showed two birds perched beneath the same tree while the storm passed overhead. Before she could admire it for more than a second, voices echoed from the entrance hall as the guests arrived earlier than expected. Expensively dressed men and women filled the mansion with polite conversation, laughter, and the steady rhythm of polished shoes crossing marble floors. Ethan immediately stiffened. His fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, and his breathing became noticeably quicker. Several guests glanced toward him with uncertain expressions before returning to their conversations. Lorenzo noticed the change instantly. He excused himself from the group and started toward his son, concern written across his face. Before he reached him, Amara quietly stepped into the library doorway, leaving it open just enough for warm afternoon sunlight to spill across the wooden floor. She picked up the picture book they had shared days earlier, settled into the reading chair, and softly turned the first page without calling Ethan's name. There was no invitation, no instruction, only the familiar sound of pages turning. After a few long moments, Ethan looked toward the library. The noise from the gathering continued behind him, but the quiet room ahead offered something different. Slowly, he stood, carried his sketchbook beneath one arm, and walked toward the open doorway. Lorenzo stopped where he was, choosing not to interrupt. From across the hall he watched his son settle onto the rug once again while Amara calmly continued reading as though this ordinary afternoon had been planned all along. None of the guests understood why the powerful host suddenly smiled at nothing in particular, but Lorenzo knew exactly what he had witnessed. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his son had chosen comfort over fear, and he had found that comfort not in wealth, authority, or carefully designed treatment plans, but in the quiet consistency of someone who had never once asked him to become anyone other than himself. That evening, after the last guests had departed and the mansion settled back into its familiar calm, Lorenzo remained alone in his study long after the lights across the estate had dimmed. The business reports spread across his desk held little of his attention. Instead, his thoughts returned again and again to the quiet moments he had witnessed over the past 2 weeks. There had been no dramatic breakthroughs, no carefully planned sessions, no expensive specialists celebrating measurable success. There had only been patience. A paper crane. A drawing in blue chalk. A story read without expectation. The realization unsettled him because it challenged everything he believed about solving problems. The next morning, he asked the head housekeeper a simple question that surprised everyone. "Tell me about Amara Johnson." The answer came without hesitation. She arrived early every day. She never complained. She often stayed a few extra minutes to help other employees finish difficult tasks before catching the bus home. She accepted praise with quiet gratitude and never asked for special treatment. Lorenzo listened without interrupting. Nothing in the report sounded extraordinary, yet perhaps that was exactly what made her different. She had never tried to become the center of anyone's attention. Later that afternoon, while reviewing contracts in the library, Lorenzo noticed Ethan sitting near the fireplace with colored pencils scattered across the rug. Amora was polishing the nearby bookshelves, humming so softly that the melody blended with the crackling fire. She was not singing for Ethan. She was simply filling the room with something gentle enough that silence no longer felt heavy. Ethan continued drawing for several minutes before stopping unexpectedly. He looked down at one empty sheet of paper, then slowly picked up a green pencil. His small hand hesitated. Without looking toward Amora, he slid the paper across the rug until it rested near her feet. She paused, glanced at the blank page, then quietly knelt beside it. Instead of asking what he wanted, she drew a single tiny leaf in one corner before placing the pencil beside the page and returning to her work. Ethan watched the leaf for a long moment. Then he pulled the paper back toward himself. One by one, more leaves appeared. Then branches. Then a sturdy trunk stretching upward. Within minutes the page had become a great oak tree standing beneath a bright blue sky. Finally, he added two small birds resting safely among the branches. When he finished, he carefully stood, walked across the room, and held the drawing toward his father with both hands. Lorenzo accepted it gently, studying every careful line. He felt emotion rise unexpectedly as he noticed one final detail. Beneath the tree, Ethan had drawn three simple figures standing together. They were holding hands. None of them had faces. None of them needed them. Lorenzo looked from the drawing to his son, then toward Amora. She simply smiled with quiet encouragement before returning to her polishing cloth, never asking for recognition. For several seconds Ethan remained standing beside his father instead of retreating into the safety of solitude. It was only a brief moment, but it was longer than any they had shared in many months. Lorenzo rested one hand softly on his son's shoulder. Ethan did not pull away. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, filling the library with warm, golden light, and for the first time since grief had settled over the DeLuca estate, the silence inside those walls no longer felt like something that needed to be feared. It felt like the beginning of a conversation that had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to hear it. Saturday arrived wrapped in brilliant autumn sunshine, and for the first time in many months the DeLuca estate felt alive rather than merely occupied. Long tables dressed in ivory linen stretched across the garden terrace overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, while friends, business partners, and charitable foundation members gathered beneath white canopies decorated with fresh greenery and soft white roses. Laughter drifted through the sea breeze, mixing with the gentle sound of waves striking the cliffs below. Inside the mansion, Amora moved quietly between the dining room and the terrace, making certain every guest had what they needed before stepping back into the background where she always preferred to remain. Lorenzo welcomed each visitor with calm confidence, yet every few minutes his eyes instinctively searched for one person. Ethan. Instead of remaining hidden upstairs, the boy stood beside the library windows with his sketchbook tucked beneath one arm. He watched the gathering without fear, observing every smile, every handshake, every child chasing bubbles across the lawn. The staff noticed the difference immediately. Weeks earlier he would have closed his bedroom door long before the first guest arrived. Today he remained close enough to witness the celebration. Amora caught his eye from across the hallway and offered nothing more than a warm smile before continuing to arrange fresh lemonade on a serving tray. She did not wave. She did not beckon him forward. She simply let him decide. After several quiet minutes, Ethan stepped outside on his own. He wandered toward the edge of the terrace where flower beds overlooked the ocean, opening his sketchbook as he sat on a stone bench warmed by the afternoon sun. Several guests noticed him and politely smiled before returning to their conversations, respecting the peaceful space surrounding the young boy. Lorenzo watched from a distance, hardly believing what he was seeing. Then something even more remarkable happened. Ethan closed the sketchbook, stood up, and slowly crossed the lawn. His small footsteps carried him directly toward Amora, who was arranging fresh flowers beside the buffet table. She looked up only after sensing someone nearby. Ethan gently reached for her hand. The entire movement lasted only a few seconds, yet it seemed to slow time itself. Conversation softened. Glasses paused halfway to waiting hands. Lorenzo felt every heartbeat echo inside his chest as his son looked first at Amora, then across the garden toward him. Ethan took one careful breath. His voice was quiet from months of disuse, almost fragile against the ocean breeze, yet every syllable carried clearly through the unexpected silence. "Daddy, she makes the silence safe." 6 simple words floated across the terrace like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. No one spoke. Several guests lowered their eyes as emotion settled gently over the gathering. The musicians quietly stopped playing without being asked. Lorenzo stood completely still, unable to look away from his son. He had imagined this moment countless times during endless sleepless nights. He believed the first words might be about school, about food, about fear, or perhaps nothing meaningful at all. He had never imagined they would reveal a truth about the heart. Ethan had not found someone who forced him back into the world. He had found someone who entered his world without demanding that it change. Lorenzo's eyes filled with tears he made no effort to hide. Across from him, Amora knelt until she was level with Ethan, gently squeezing his hand with quiet reassurance before releasing it again. She smiled as though those 6 words belonged entirely to him, because they did. And in that breathtaking moment, every person standing beneath the autumn sky understood that the greatest miracles rarely arrived with applause. Sometimes they arrived in the gentle courage of a child who finally felt safe enough to be heard. The gathering slowly resumed, but nothing felt quite the same after those 6 quiet words. Conversations returned in softer voices, laughter carried a gentler warmth, and more than one guest found an excuse to step toward the ocean for a private moment of reflection. Lorenzo remained where he stood, unable to pull his eyes away from Ethan. For so long he had measured progress by reports, appointments, and opinions from experts who sincerely wanted to help. He had searched for answers in schedules, strategies, and solutions, believing that if he worked hard enough he could somehow repair the silence surrounding his son. Yet standing beneath the golden afternoon sky, he finally understood something that had escaped him through every difficult month. Silence had never been Ethan's enemy. Fear had been. The fear of disappointing people who desperately wanted him to become someone else. Amora had never asked that of him. She had never celebrated tiny victories as though he were a project to complete. She had simply accepted every quiet moment as meaningful on its own. Lorenzo slowly crossed the terrace until he reached his son. He knelt without speaking, careful not to rush the fragile peace that surrounded them. Ethan looked at his father, and for the first time in longer than Lorenzo could remember, there was no uncertainty in the boy's eyes. There was calm. Lorenzo smiled through tears that the ocean breeze quickly carried away. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. Ethan gave a small nod before resting his head briefly against his father's shoulder. It lasted only a few seconds, but Lorenzo treasured the moment more than every business success he had ever celebrated. Nearby, Amora quietly returned to arranging flowers, believing the family deserved the space to enjoy their reunion without drawing attention to herself. She never noticed Lorenzo approaching until he stood beside her. "Walk with me for a moment," he said gently. Together they followed a stone path leading toward the gardens where colorful autumn leaves drifted across the grass. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally Lorenzo broke the comfortable silence. "I thought I had to rescue my son from his silence," he admitted. "Instead, you taught me that I needed to stop treating silence like something broken." Amora looked toward the ocean where sunlight shimmered across the water. "Children know when they are being listened to," she answered quietly. "Even before they hear words, they recognize kindness. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is allowing them to feel completely safe exactly as they are." Lorenzo lowered his eyes, reflecting on every hurried conversation, every anxious attempt to encourage progress, every moment he had unknowingly allowed worry to replace presence. He realized that while he had always loved Ethan beyond measure, he had spent too much time trying to lead him back into the world and too little time joining him where he already was. The realization did not fill him with regret alone. It filled him with hope, because hope meant tomorrow could be different from yesterday. As the sun slowly settled toward the horizon, Ethan wandered through the garden carrying his sketchbook beneath one arm, occasionally stopping to admire butterflies resting among the late blooming flowers. He no longer looked like a lonely child hiding from life. He looked like a boy discovering that the world could be gentle after all. Lorenzo watched him with quiet gratitude, knowing that the greatest change inside the DeLuca estate had not been the return of his son's voice. It had been the return of trust, patiently restored one ordinary act of kindness at a time. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet steadiness that no one inside the DeLuca estate wanted to disturb. Nothing extraordinary happened overnight, and perhaps that was the greatest gift of all. Morning sunlight continued to pour through the tall windows, the ocean continued to shimmer beyond the cliffs, and the familiar rhythm of the household slowly transformed from careful routine into something warmer. Ethan no longer spent every hour behind closed doors. Some mornings he carried his sketchbook into the library before breakfast. Other afternoons he wandered through the garden searching for birds, flowers, and clouds worthy of another drawing. Sometimes he spoke a sentence. Sometimes only a word. Sometimes he chose silence again, but no one rushed to fill it anymore. Lorenzo learned to sit beside his son without asking questions that demanded answers. They watched sunsets together from the stone terrace, turned pages of picture books together, and occasionally built paper airplanes that floated across the lawn before landing in the tall grass. There were moments when Ethan smiled without realizing he was smiling, and those simple expressions became more valuable to Lorenzo than every achievement he had ever celebrated in the outside world. Amora never changed the way she carried herself. She continued arriving before sunrise with her canvas tote and thermos of coffee, greeting every employee with the same kindness she had shown on her first day. She never reminded anyone of what had happened at the garden gathering. She never accepted praise as though she had accomplished something remarkable. Whenever people thanked her, she simply answered that every child deserved to feel safe enough to be themselves. One evening, as the staff prepared the dining room for dinner, everyone paused in surprise. A place setting had been added to the long family table. Not at the far end reserved for employees. Not hidden near the kitchen entrance. It stood beside Ethan's chair, set with the same simple elegance as every other place at the table. No announcement accompanied the change. Lorenzo merely looked toward Amora and said, "If you are willing, there will always be a place for you here." She hesitated for a moment, humbled by the invitation, before quietly taking her seat. Ethan looked from his father to Amora, then smiled as though the arrangement made perfect sense. During dinner they spoke when words came naturally and enjoyed silence when they did not. For the first time in years, the great dining room felt less like a mansion and more like a home. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, the walls that had once echoed with loneliness carried new sounds instead. The turning of book pages. Gentle laughter drifting down long hallways. The scratch of colored pencils across paper. The quiet conversations of a father discovering that love was measured less by perfect answers than by patient presence. Visitors who returned months later often remarked that the estate somehow felt brighter, though they could never explain why. The marble floors had not changed. The priceless paintings remained exactly where they had always been. The garden still overlooked the same endless ocean. What had changed could not be purchased, renovated, or designed. It had been restored through compassion offered without expectation, dignity given without condition, and trust earned one ordinary moment at a time. Lorenzo often looked at the paper crane that still rested on the hallway table where the first silent exchange had begun. It reminded him that the strongest people were not always those who commanded the loudest voices. Sometimes they were the ones who listened long enough for another heart to speak. And on that quiet stretch of coastline, beneath skies that seemed a little wider than before, the world remembered what dignity truly looks like.